Welcome to Business Repair Shop. Tonight, what's the deal with front ends? And actually, the histories of tractors and all things cool. I'll be right back.
Hey, all right, so in our continuing series on what's the deal with, tonight, what's the deal with, I think it was Patch asked the other day, last video, about what's the deal with adjustable front ends. So, all my tractors are narrow front end. So I was thinking about what I would do for research on this particular subject and what that would look like. And what I thought maybe we'll go through is going to be more of a why tractors look this way for a while. Predominantly from the mid-20s, we'll discuss, up until the 60s, what my theory is on why they look like this, and why narrow fronts and then wide fronts and adjustable, and why that was all important. So let's get started. So the word tractor, the term tractor, was first seen on an 1890 patent. Don't know who the guy wrote it. It was actually a steam engine still that would have had some kind of a mechanism to drive, because up until before then, what you would do, you would have your big threshing machines that would need to get powered off a belt. So you have these big steam engines that were notorious for blowing up. You would drag them out to a field with a team of horses, set them up, hook your belt up to your threshing machine, do your thing, and then take it back in. It couldn't get itself to the field. It couldn't do anything. It was just a stationary motor. And they could, you'd set it up where you wanted to set it up. So in 1890, like I said, that was the first patent that you saw the word tractor. And then it would have been John Froelich, something. He's in Clayton County, Iowa, actually. In 1892 was the first one that came up with the gasoline-powered tractor. It was a one-cylinder, and it was kind of the same concept where, would run a big belt, but it had a gearbox on it so you could drive it around. And from there, that wasn't really a very much of a success. He ended up getting hooked up with the guys that eventually made, he was near Waterloo, Iowa. They made the Waterloo Boy, which later became John, kind of incorporated into when John Deere tractors actually started making tractors. But that first tractor wasn't really a success. The first successful American tractor was built by Hart Power. And that was in 1901. I think is when they first decided. It was like 1901, 1903 is when they kind of first came out with that first design. And that was the first, they made like 15 models of it, commercially success. In the early 1900s, Hart Power was the biggest selling manufacturer of tractors. And those were big, bulky. A lot of times what people will call those now, they'll call them prairie tractors or prairie busting tractors, because essentially what you had was, in that time, you were a lot of this land that had never been farmed, so you had to go out and try and bust it up, and it was tough, and so you'd have these big machines, because everything at that point was just huge. I think on those early Hart Powers, it was like a 10-inch bore or a 13-inch bore by 10-inch, something stupid big, 2-cylinder, just huge, and they just pump, just slowly pump along. But it was better than steam, because you didn't have, whammy kablammy if something went wrong. And there was steam tractors as well at that same time. But once the electric start is what killed steam cars and steam tractors. If you watch any of Jay Leno videos, he talks a lot about that is really what killed the steam industry, was the electric start. You weren't turning it over by hand. Even though electric start in tractors didn't become common until, a lot later than that, and the hand start was still the way, the writing was on the wall. The starter technology caught up with what they needed it to do. But that still doesn't get me to why do all 40s and 50s tractors, or 30s, mid-20s to 60s, look kind of the same? Most of them narrow front. So we'll get into that. So that's how tractors used to look. They were big, bulky. I'll put some pictures up. At that same time, the whole entire industry was trying to figure out what a tractor was going to look at, and everyone was trying different things. You had front-wheel drive things. There was one Moline, which became Minneapolis Moline. They had a thing they called the Universal, and it was a front engine with 2 wheels, and then it would hook up to implements. And the design there was that you could use implements that you would use behind your horses normally to pull. Well, that was fine and dandy, but it was pretty lightweight, and so you could pull certain things, but you couldn't. There was issues with them where they were really light on the back when there's nothing hooked up to it, so they could, bounce forward and do all sorts of weird things. And so that was kind of an odd design where, you were kind of like sitting over top of the implement. And the reason why, so at that time too, I'm getting sidetracked, which is the norm. So you'd have these big tractors, would be prairie busting tractors. You could go out and plow a bunch of stuff and tear up the land so you could plant. But then when you had to cultivate, which is at that time there wasn't like now where there's different chemicals and things that farmers will use to kill weeds and have weed control. You would have to cultivate, which is basically everyone that's watching this knows what it is, but in case you don't, looks the little thing that basically goes between the rows, tears up whatever in between your corn. So if there's weeds and stuff growing, you can kill it that way. It just kind of rips them out the root. And that was a really good weed control. Still is good today. There's still a lot of like organic farmers and stuff that do that. Well, these big old tractors, they couldn't cultivate well. So those smaller kind of odd ones, like you said in that picture you saw earlier of that Universal, that would work, but you couldn't. It was kind of a one niche thing. Like you could do other things with it, yes, but not that well. So fast forward to the early 1920s, International, which would become Farmall, when they would, with this tractors, I think might have been the first time they made Farmall. Don't quote me on that. Or they started calling stuff Farmall. They made a tractor called the Regular, and that is, according to everything that I've researched, the first row crop tractor. And when they say row crop, that meant your back wheels were adjustable. So depending on what kind of spacing you had in your field, you could adjust your back wheels, and your front wheels were narrow and usually at an angle so they'd fit between two rows. And this allowed you could put a cultivator on the front. Your operator was behind it so they could watch what was going on easily without having to turn their head all the time, and if something was going on or when the guy was planting was off a little bit, running half the crop over. And so that was when it started. It was the early 1920s. And if you see after that, it's basically by the 30s, almost all tractors are beginning to develop that look. There's a few odd, other ones, but most are developing that tricycle look. There'll still be wide fronts, and there still was manufacturers making wide fronts. There's aftermarket companies making wide fronts. But that became the popular tractor. And the next thing that would develop would be the mounted corn picker. And I believe that the reason why you see the popularity of tractors looking like this is because of the cultivator and the mounted corn picker. Because both of those had to be on a narrow front end. You could have, and there was pole type pickers. Obviously my grandpa had one of those back when, I'll tell the story someday of our Super. I think I've told a little bit of it. But there was pole type, but it was a lot of farmers like the mounted one. You could, again, it was you weren't trying to drag it behind your tractor and then have your wagon behind that. It was just boom, boom. But you couldn't do that with the wide front. You kind of needed to be right there. So those became popular. Well, by the time the early 60s were coming around, in the 60s into the 70s, that mounted pickers were starting to go away. You had full self-propelled combines that were becoming more popular, and you had cultivating was starting to was losing popularity. It was still getting used. I mean, I'm down the comments here and saying, we were, yes, you still were, but it was becoming, the bigger farms were getting, you had to get bigger cultivators, and you could get big ones, but it became a point where when you got really big ones, you weren't mounting a midway on your tractor. So when you didn't have to mount a midway on the tractor, you could then have a wide front, which that's also what we're going to get into with wide front ends. Adjustable wide front ends, and every manufacturer is a little different how they did it, but basically there was preset bolt holes usually. You'd line those two bolt holes up, set them, and then that would be for your different, I run a 38-inch rows like they used to run back in the day. I run a 30-inch rows, or this is in this crop that I have to run it in different things. And so that's what, I guess it's kind of the deal with front ends, and why tractors all kind of look the same for a while, and why I think those two implements, because when you saw those two implements go away, mounted corn pickers, I mean, again, farmers use them a lot longer. I mean, they're still, today, but the majority of farmers weren't, so the manufacturers, I mean, you could get a narrow front end all the way up to the 4-digit, there's 4-digit Olivers, but it wasn't as common. And, so it was, and it's always, now it's funny because the narrow front end, that muscle tractors, 60s and 70s era tractors are super popular because they just look beefy. But at the same time, when they came out, they weren't as handy to have around the farm. You know, if you have a narrow front end with a loader without power steering, it's going to be you're not going to have a fun time. Versus the wide front end, it helps, makes it a little bit easier to run, it's a little stabler. But yeah, so I get that's kind of the what's the deal with adjustable front ends slash. Like I said, once I started getting into it, I thought, I think it's a good discussion to talk about why tractors kind of, I mean, if you didn't know anything about tractors, and you had them all in black and white and took all the emblems off of them, they all were aesthetically the same concept for that entire time. And I get that, you know, physics, it's the old story of post-World War II when England was trying to develop their own atomic bomb. And basically, America had said before then, during World War II, they were helping us build with our atomic and nuclear program. And after that, we got kind of freaked out. We pushed everybody out. They had to develop their own. Well, they came to the table after they had developed it and said, "Here's what we know." And the Americans said, "Here's what we know." And they basically the thing that came out of that discussion was, well, physics work the same on both sides of the ocean. Well, physics work the same way depending on where your tractor is manufactured. Like, this is going to work because, again, all the implement companies were making things that worked with tractors that looked similar to all the narrow front stuff from that time period. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I think that, you know, and again, tractors still, in theory, all look the same now. I mean, they all that same, that's you know, the same look. And it's the same way with, you know, automobiles. They figured it out. But until then, they didn't know. So I guess that's what's the deal with adjustable front end slash tractors. Thanks for checking it out. Like and subscribe. And we'll see you on the next one. Hopefully, we did figure out, little sidebar here, that is a 77 radiator. I did the measuring on it, so it's the wrong radiator technically. I don't care, it's a pulling tractor. But the wrong radiator for that model. That's why it was weird. So I'm going to get that to my guy this week. Hopefully my parts come in for Otis. And we'll be able to get Otis back and running here soon, and then we'll start the next project. I think it's going to be getting those tires off the Super, and I figured out so. All right, we'll see you on the next one. Like and subscribe. You know what to do. Bye.